Welcome to Survivor Space and today's Survivor Circle session on the trauma triangle. I'm Becky Perkins, Survivor Support Specialist with Zero Abuse Project, and I'm pleased to welcome my friend Rick Goodman, who is going to give today's presentation as a follow-up to his prior presentation on ego state theory. So if you have not yet watched that recording, we encourage you to do that. It will help to make this one make a little bit more sense. But for now, I am happy to turn it over to Rick. Welcome, Rick.
Well, thank you, Becky. It is good to be here once again. And hello to all you folks out there. As part of our webinar series, today's presentation is called The Drama Triangle, Teachings to Live a Happier and Healthier Life. And as Becky said, this is really a part 2. It's going to be predicated on a previous webinar we did on ego state theory. So if you got some time, and you're coming into this webinar new, then flip back to ego state theory, because it'll make this workshop particularly meaningful. I work in a shop that serves many men who've experienced childhood trauma and abuse, among other issues. But just to say that today's work, this notion of the drama triangle, speaks to everyone. It's not just for those folks who've experienced abuse. It's not just for men. It's for folks of all genders and all issues. So it's not terribly a trauma-centric model, yet at the same time, it is a very rich and useful tool and skill set to have for anyone wanting to live a happier, healthier life. And in my years of working with guys who have experienced childhood trauma, this has particular resonance for them. So that's the topic today, and be pleased to get into all of that. But before we do so, just to recognize that our work here at Zero Abuse, particularly the Survivor Space programming, is funded by the U.S. Department of Justice. And it's those tax dollars that go into helping support this type of programming. And so just want to give credit where credit is worthy, and thank the folks at the Department of Justice for undertaking this service for folks who have experienced trauma, sexual violence, and are working towards healing, working towards recovery. That's what it's all about. And again, I'm glad to be here. Okay, so I'm going to need to do a bit of a recap of what ego state theory is about, in order that we can make true usefulness of the drama triangle. And I think just to start off with, we need to define a couple things. And the first word we may need to define is the term ego. And we're not using it in the conventional understanding, like, boy, Rick thinks he knows so much, he must have a big ego doing webinars like that. That's not the way we're using this word. The word ego in this application originally comes from the work of Freud. And if you've ever studied psychology, even if it's been many years since you had those dusty textbooks, you may recall that Freud said that there was 3 components of our psyche, of what makes us people. He had the term of instinctual drives, because he believed that people, like other animals on this planet, we are ruled by instincts. Freud had 2 categories of instincts that he put particular emphasis in. One, of course, was his interest in sex as a driver of the human condition, And he called that instinctual drive eros. And he also believed that there was an instinctual drive towards death and destruction, which he called thanatos. So that was one component of personality. Well, luckily, we don't have to get into that component today. Freud had another term that he called the superego. And the superego was a notion of a shared morality that people have, no matter where you are on this planet, your race, culture, gender. We seem to have a preset, shared sense of moral structure. We don't terribly, we're not terribly conscious of it, but it seems to govern much of human activity. That notion of superego is not part of this workshop. We're glad to say that too. The last part of how Freud defined us as people is of interest to us. And he used the term ego as to define the conscious and pre-conscious self that we all hold, that we all contain. So I'm going to say, if you're sitting here, you're watching the webinar, this webinar is going to go for the time it is. It's not going to go all day long. There's an implicit learning contract in the sense I'm supposedly the one knowledgeable about the subject matter, and I will share my knowledge. And your role is of learner, to take in this information and see if it applies to your life and run with it if it does. That is what we could say is our conscious self. Knowing that when the webinar is over, both you and I and Becky and everyone else, we're going to scatter and do our other 101 responsibilities we have to get through the day. So this is the notion that we want to focus on, the sense of a conscious self. And I'm going to use another word here, not just the conscious self, like today is Monday and we're on this webinar, but I'm going to see a pre-conscious self we also have to be attentive to. So an example of a pre-conscious self is if I asked you to draw that attention to your big toe in your left foot. And chances are you weren't aware of that relative comfort in your toe until I said the words. By saying the words, I brought your pre-conscious awareness to consciousness. Maybe some of you wiggled your toe just to find out how that toe is doing. So we need to encompass both levels of our understanding of ourselves, so that we can get on with life. We can make decisions, do the things we need to do, again, pursue that happier, healthier life. That is the interest of ego state theory, and it was really the work of Eric Berne, the originator of this model of psychology back in his work in the 40s, 50s, when Berne was taking a lot of what Freud was saying and yet running with it in his own direction. And this is, again, was the focus of Berne's work, which is going to lead us to the drama triangle. So while I say that, today we're on this webinar, it's going to go for a certain length of time, and then we're going to get back to the busyness of our respective lives. This is true. This is where we like to think we are most of the time. Most of us, most of the time, believe we're in this rational, conscious sense of being. And using Berne's model now of ego states, he called that adult ego state. Now, when we get into these titles, don't get too preoccupied about the relative age of what it means to be an adult or child or parent, because I'll let you in now on a biggie. It doesn't matter your relative age. It doesn't matter if you're 19 or 99. You have components of all three ego states within you. I have components of all three ego states within me. However, if we wanted to focus in on our conscious self, our rational self, a self that is anchored in the here and now, anchored in the present tense, Byrne would say we are in our adult ego state. If we're in our adult ego state, we can tap into all the life skills, awarenesses that we have because we're big people and we can access all those. And even if we don't know something, our adult ego state allows us to do neat things like ask questions, ask for help, because it's our best guarantee that we're going to get what we need out of any situation by staying in adult ego state. If we're anchored in the here and now, and we can tap into all these resources, our emotional expression is going to be relatively modest. It'll be proportionate to the situation we're in. It won't be necessarily overwhelming. And I'm saying all these things now because we're going to go into the drama triangle. We're going to look at situations when maybe our emotions are overwhelming and how difficult that is to hold oneself in those situations. All to say is that each one of us has an adult ego state. And I'm going to say that's a sweet spot in life. However, you see the other ego states mentioned on this page. So we need to understand those as well. Because there are times in our adult life, 19 or 99, where we're not feeling rational, we're not feeling anchored in the moment, our feelings are not proportionate, and we're looking at influences of how we have been, how we learn to become ourselves, and this is all from the past. So the first ego state we need to reference is the notion of child ego state. And these are the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that we first internalized, we first became accustomed to when we were little ones. When we came into this world, and we had to make sense of the world. We had to make sense of the world very quickly. We learned we are different than these entities around us. That was probably our first core learning. And that to get our needs met as infants, we had to engage with these entities, maybe they're called mother or father or whoever, to get our needs met. And our perspective when we were little like that was that it was all through a self-absorbed lens. That's the only way children make sense of the world. Their only reference point is themselves. So everything they internalize through their own needs of self, get to make sure their needs are met as a survival strategy, and it becomes a way of operating in this world. So obviously, when we were toddlers, our operating system was an adult ego state. Our operating system was much, much different. And we can call that child ego state. Young children like that, as we all know, they don't feel angry. As an adult, in adult ego state, I can say, well, I feel angry about this issue. I'm frustrated over this. But children don't feel angry. Toddlers just are angry. They encompass their emotions. It becomes their core presentation. So we know there's big differences between that sense of adult ego state that we share as big people, and yet this notion of how we were when we were small. That's not behind us, even though obviously no one on this webinar is age 2, 3, or 4, but it's still with us. So I'm going to make reference to the example here. You're at work, so you're coming in Monday morning. You want to get a cup of coffee before you sit down wherever you work, and someone says, "Oh, before you do that, hey, the big boss wants to see you." And you go, "What? What's that about?" And they say, "Well, I don't know, but they said that they want you to come to their office as soon as possible." And you may find that as you're going to the office of your big boss, you're starting to feel a bit shaky. You're starting to I think, oh boy, what's this all about? And something, am I in trouble? Type of thing. And by the actual time you're there knocking on the door, you may feel not yourself. Even how you verbally present yourself, you may be stammering. Oh, hi there. I heard that maybe you want to see me now for something. Um, and that those insecurities, that sense of fear, that like maybe you're getting into trouble, is not anchored in the present. It's a historic replay from the past. We could call that child ego state. And your big boss may say, yeah, I'm glad you're here. You handed in your expense claim, but you forgot to sign it. And the bookkeeper's showing up this morning. And oh, I'm sorry, and you sign it, but it still may take you a while to get back to your normal adult ego state self. That's child ego state. It's still within you, it's still within me, it shows on occasion. Parent ego state, a little bit the same, a little bit different. When we're a bit older, more older childhood, we can no longer just rely upon our learned experiences in child ego state to make sense of the world. To make sense of this world, it's way too complicated just to earn that experience to get through life. And so children at this age, whether it's from mom, dad, authority figures, idols, people you want to emulate, children of that age essentially copy the messages that they've heard from these authority figures. The thoughts, feelings, behavior, term we could use is they swallow them whole. And to do that, this allows them to keep up with understanding the complexity of life. So this notion of parent ego state is a separate voice, a separate code of being. It's not anchored in the present, just like child ego state, parent ego state is from the past, but we learn it in older childhood rather than younger childhood. And we take these messages, we internalize them, we swallow them whole, in the sense that as children, we can't discern what is the part of the messages that you want to learn versus other parts you don't. Children don't have that ability to discern at that age, so they just take it all in and they make it their own, not a conscious process. So if we wanted an example of parent ego state, and we would say, well, I could share this one as a parent when my children were smaller and they were, doing stuff around the house. Maybe they're in the living room making a mess, dirty dishes or whatever. And in my reaction to them, I may, say "Arr, to them and their mess. And as I'm saying that, I'm having this eerie familiarity that that's how my father would speak to me when I was that age. Then I'm really doing a replay of messages that I learned from my parents, and now they're influencing how I am with my children. So this is brief, I realize this, but just to say, we have three parts of ourselves now. It's usually for those folks who are in a process of recovery from abuse or other childhood wounds, it can be quite helpful to look at parts of ourselves to help figure out the way to recovery. So here are three parts of ourselves. One, which is anchored quite significantly in the present tense, the adult ego state. That's when we get things done. That's when, we're fully present. And yet there are times in our life that we're living in the past. We're doing a replay of some sort. And these older operating systems, child ego state, parent ego state, are not terribly effective because they're not based in the present. They're based on the past. So we could call them relics of an operating system. It'd be like going to a junkyard and saying, oh, look at the red car over there. And your buddy may say, well, Rick, that's you're right. It looks like a car. It's got, four wheels and a steering wheel and what have you, but it doesn't function. It doesn't work. It's a junker, So the notion that these other two ego states are more relics rather than being fully operational. Okay, there we go. That's a quick and dirty of the three ego states. Here's another way of just presenting them. The only one that is anchored in the present is the adult. And when we dip down, the dotted line here is really critical, because when we dip out of the present and we are now in some sort of replay of the past, that's when the other adult or the other ego states kick in. Our job to live a happier and healthier life is to stay in the present. And that's where we want to be. But if our background, if our childhood experience was such that we experienced abuse, trauma, neglect, family dysfunction, addictions in our family, then chances are we're going to live more in the past, because we've spent more of our time in these child ego state, parent ego states of being. And that's much different than, say, someone who grew up with a family that wasn't dysfunctional and that individual didn't experience great harms in their upbringing. And that person, relatively speaking, will spend more time in their adult ego state. They still will dip back in the past, because everyone on this planet has these three elements to themselves. But for that second person, they're going to be spending most of their time in the present, in the here and now, in adult ego state, and again, getting things done in life. So that's the concept, that's the theory, that's what we want to work on today. Now, let's go back to history here. Eric Berne, follower of Freud's, but kind of broke off and did his own thing around ego state theory. He had his own kind of followers in terms of psychology. One of them was a fellow by the name of Stephen Karpman. Stephen Karpman was a psychologist for the Los Angeles police force. And the story holds true that the Karpman was challenged by police officers that his job was to support them in their work. And the message that he received from these police officers was essentially saying, "Oh, Dr. Karpman, you're so smart. You explain this to us. Why is it that on the most difficult calls we have as police officers, why is it that, and those calls were concerning domestic violence disputes, why is it that when we go out, we get a call and we go out to the home, Dr. Karpman, when, of course, the first thing we do is we separate the two parties and we do an assessment of who's been hitting whom. And let's say, for this example, it's a heterosexual couple, and let's, for example, say that the fellow has assaulted his female partner. So Dr. Karpman, we make that assessment, we figure out who's been hitting whom, we put the cuffs on the fellow, and then the protocol is to, of course, take him down, put him in the squad car, take him to the police station for processing, fingerprints and all that. But Dr. Karpman, as we're taking him out, this often happens, that we hear from his partner, the person who's being harmed, saying, "Stop it. You're hurting my husband." And not only that, Dr. Karpman, sometimes we actually get assaulted by the woman, by the victim of the domestic violence situation. So explain that to us. Now, Karpman was a follower of Burns, and they had correspondence on this. And through that correspondence came this notion of the drama triangle, sometimes called the Karpman triangle for obvious reasons. Let's now look at how Karpman would interpret the situation of the police call. And then we're going to generalize that and take it into a situation that could apply to all of us in life. So this is what his work came out to be. Let's just define the drama triangle first. Unconscious, repetitive sequence of transactions, engagements, perceptions, interactions between the self and the environment. Their underlying issues: powerlessness, lack of responsibility, and lack of compassion for self. So this is the opening sequence. Okay. In the situation that Karpman heard, of course, there was a victim involved, the victim of the domestic violence. And you see the victim position on the triangle at the bottom. You see a little mathematical sign underneath the name victim. And that suggests that as a victim of anything, you're in the negative. You're, relatively speaking, in terms of power, you don't have power. It's the other person who has the relative power. So that's why it's a negative sign first, and then a slash, and then the positive sign refers to the other. And we know that the core stance of a victim is one of helplessness or powerlessness. Okay. And we also know in the situation that there is a persecutor. This is Karpman's word to define the person who's been victimizing the first person. Here we see a reversal of the power structure. The persecutor, of course, having the relative power in the situation, the victim relatively not having the power. And here we have words of sense of loss of control, aggression, blame, and hostility, kind of core traits of anyone in a persecutory role. Okay, that's the situation, and then the police come on the scene. Now, Karpman's language is the word rescuer, but to be fair, police officers do more than rescuing in this world. We grant police officers an incredible amount of authority so that they can do their job. But in terms of the function of the police officer, the function of the police officer or police officers in the situation is one of rescuing. They come in on the scene. Now, interesting enough here, look at the mathematical equation for rescuer, and you'll see it's identical to the mathematical equation for persecutors. Because as a rescuer, there's an assumption you make. The assumption you make is that, first of all, that you have the ability to rescue others. You have the skill set, you have the knowledge, you have the know-how, you have the marbles. And the person that you're rescuing doesn't have the knowledge, doesn't have the capacity, doesn't have the skill set, doesn't have the habits. So then there's a dynamic set up in the mind of the rescuer to do the job of rescuing. And we have other words: people pleasing, not taking care of the self. In terms of the functional role of the police officers, they come in on the scene, and there we go. We've got the opening tableau of the situation of domestic violence intervention. But the core thing about the drama triangle is that these three roles do not remain static. These three roles change. Note the arrows around the triangle, and they go any which way. So in times of dysfunction, now I'm going to throw this word in now, because the persecutor role, the victim role, and the rescuer role, these are not adult ego states. The function of these roles stem from way back. They're old, preset standards of behavior that we aren't even aware of. This is where this comes from. And by having these preset vulnerabilities, not only do we get on the triangle, often in a non-conscious way, we don't choose to get on a triangle, but once we're on the triangle, it's almost like a dance, a sequence of activities with the other people, in which the roles may change. So let's go back to the original Karpman situation. The woman is a victim, her husband is a persecutor, the police come in as rescuers, but then it changes. It changes when she says, "Stop it, you're hurting my husband." Now, her core stance shifts from victim to rescuer. The husband, who was seen as persecutor, is now being seen as victim, and the position of the police officer is no longer rescuer. The police officer is now being perceived as persecutor. So everyone's role just has shifted dramatically with a conscious or rational choice. And not only that, it changes once again, because in some cases, the victim will assault the police officer. So what do we have going on there? Well, we have the victim, the original victim who moved into rescue, now is persecutor, because she's striking out against the police officers. The police officers came on the scene as rescuers, were seen then as persecutors, end up being victims. They're on the receiving end of the violence, and we can only wonder what could happen to the original persecutor in this dynamic. But this is a map now of dysfunction. This is a map of unhappy dynamics. Often we can understand them of how we are with other people, and sometimes the unhappy dynamics of the drama triangle all occur in our head. Still, it's these three core positions, not conscious positions, not rational positions. They stem from a mishmash of child ego state and parent ego state. There is no adult ego state at all on the drama triangle. So, what do we make of this? Well, we can first of all say, let's get really familiar with this. You know, this topic may be new for you, but I'm going to say if you're, you were brought up in wherever, chances are you know this stuff in spades. So let's go back to how we learn this stuff. Well, you could say, well, just what did you just last watch on, your streaming channel of your choice? Was it a drama? Was it a comedy? It doesn't matter, but chances are that this drama triangle is part of the depiction of how people get along or how people don't get along. This is so endemic to our culture, it's hard to even see it when it's in front of us. But let's go back to, let's go back to when we were little, and think of how, even as toddlers were exposed to this. So I'm thinking of the notion of fairy tales, and we could choose any children's story to depict this, but my favorite one to go to is the story of Little Red Riding Hood. Okay, I think we all know the general gist of that story. The book opens up. We've got Red. She's planning to go. Where is she going? She's going to Grandma's house. Why is she going to Grandma's house? Well, Grandma is not feeling well, and Red is bringing a basket full of goodies. Okay, right there, we've got someone who's not well. Grandma's the victim. We've got Red coming to the rescue, armed with her basket of goodies. But we know something happens before she gets to the house, and that is the involvement of the big bad wolf. Of course, the big bad wolf, simply by definition, is a persecutor. And we know what the big bad wolf does. Big bad wolf eats Grandma up, and then dresses in Grandma's clothing, hides in Grandma's bed, waiting for Red to show up. Okay, so we've got victim, rescuer, and persecutor right there. Now, before Red comes along, because of the impending doom, as she's going to be another victim, who comes along? Well, we've got another character to consider, and that's the woodsman with his big axe, and he knows what's going down. So we have the woodsman coming on. as a rescuer, because Red's the impending victim, obviously. Persecutor is the wolf. But not only does he rescue Red, and since she doesn't get eaten, the rescuer chops the wolf up in 101 pieces. So the wolf, or the woodsman, shifts from rescuer to persecutor. The wolf shifts from persecutor to victim. Happy ever after kind of story. If that makes sense to you, in terms of, oh yeah, I knew all that stuff, then this is what we need to familiarize with. Whether we're talking about the nature of unhappy families or the nature of unhappy work teams, or problems in society, we often see this notion of victim, persecutor, rescuer play out again and again and again. And what we know of this dynamic is that it can be endless. And that this is a perpetuating dynamic in any, potentially for any grouping. So yeah, that troubled family, that problematic work team. This is now a way that we can discern what the problem is going on. Now, nothing good comes from jumping on this triangle, because there's no adult ego state on the triangle to come up with the solution. And yet we're all prone to jumping on this triangle. When we jump on the triangle, often without thinking, without seeing, the only problems can occur. So our job is to ensure that we don't jump on the triangle. How do we do that? We do that with the skills and awarenesses of adult ego state. So I want to give a personal example here. True story of a dynamic that has occurred in my experiences being a parent. So I can call this my, kind of my good dad moment, my bad dad moment. But and I want to be kind of light with this because we all are prone to being on the triangle. Let me tell you about the bad dad moment first. When my kids were younger, we had dinner, we had dessert. There was a piece of pie left over. The deal was the kids were going to split the piece of pie later. Okay, that was it. That was for dinner. And then later on, I get a message from my younger child saying, "Dad, that's not fair. Older says she ate the whole piece of pie. We were supposed to share that. That's not fair." And I felt like I was on the spot. So unthinkingly, I go find my oldest. I'm going to use my finger because so often the persecutor, if you want to know someone's persecuting, if you get the energy, they're pointing their finger, chances are they're in that position. And I go, "What's the story here? I hear that you ate the whole piece of pie and the deal was you're going to share that with your sister." And I hear the message, "Oh, right. You always seem to be on her side of things, don't you?" Ow. So there I was on my rescuing high horse because there was a perceived victim. I intervened. I spoke to the perceived persecutor, what I perceived, and the dynamic didn't come out effectively. It didn't achieve the outcome that made anyone happy. It was a lose situation. And I lost in the sense that I was challenged by showing favoritism to one child over another. That was a bad dad moment. Now let's take the same situation and make it a good dad moment. Same story, dinner, dessert, one piece of pie, left over. The deal is that the two were going to divvy that up later on. And then I get approached by my younger saying, Dad, it's not fair. She ate the whole last piece of pie. We were supposed to share it. Now here's my response in adult use. Something like, kid, I'm sorry to hear that. I was there. I remember the two of you had that agreement. But I can't make that piece of pie come back for you. So I think you're going to need to talk to your older sister to resolve this between the two of you. That's what you need to do to find resolution. So there, I'm not copping out of my parental responsibility. I think I'm holding it, but I'm not trying to rescue either of the kids to the work that they need to do to resolve their conflict. I stay in adult ego state in the second category. I don't jump on the triangle. And I give some direction about the two of them need to talk to each other about this. And I could give further support to the process, but not to one individual over another. So same situation could be handled two different ways. It's a simple example, but I think a telling example about the potential that the drama triangle can have for all of us to shoot for changes that we want to make in our lives. Now, one thing that Karpman said that I think is really important is that we all need to be familiar with what he called our default positions. A default position is this, that which one of these three positions are you most vulnerable to falling into in a situation of conflict or stress or unexpected anxiety? Where do you tend to go? Now, I work with a lot of people in the mental health field. I'm myself trained as a therapist. I know where I go. My default is always towards rescuing. Why? Well, first of all, chances are I wouldn't have chosen this as a profession if I didn't have that as a default strategy. But I just know myself. I know myself well. That I draw comfort from that position. Now, I can say I draw comfort, but it's not healthy. It's not functional. It's really dysfunctional. So I have to guard against that default. And I'm going to suggest for anyone who's watching this, and I guess Becky, this when we finish, what's your default position on the drama triangle? The more we're familiar with our vulnerability, the more we can guard against it. Before we finish up, though, I want to just point out that we can all get hooked. We can all jump on this triangle. And I'm making this pitch now, particularly if there's people on this call that are counselors, are in a position of helping others. But I'm going to say it's true. We can all get hooked on this triangle because we all have this vulnerability. So the last thing in life we want to do is to do a bad rescue. We don't want to get hooked in any dynamic with others. So whether this issue is coming up in your family or your work team or in your role as a professional in whatever job you have, you can avoid bad rescues by asking, well, have you been asked to help? Your neighbor or your brother or your partner may be having an issue, but unless you have been invited in to the situation, it's not truly your issue to resolve. So first question to ask, have you been asked for help? If so, great, then you got clarity. If not, hold off. Or that could turn out to be a bad rescue. Secondly, do you have the capacity, the time, the energy to actually do the helping. That's a key one to consider. We know there are many situations in this world, much like people, when they see someone who's flailing around in the water, they jump in to save them, only to realize that they can't swim themselves. So we have to be really careful to discern our capacity to help another. In my role, given I work a lot with issues of trauma and past victimization, I get hit up a fair bit on legal advice. Do I give legal advice? No. Why? Because I'm not a lawyer. I can maybe help someone find a lawyer, but that's about as far as I can go, because if I start giving legal advice, that's going to backfire. It's not going to work well for whoever I'm talking to. It's not going to work well for me. It's going to be a bad rescue. Third question to ask yourself, do you want to do what you're ever asked to do? Now, again, you could say, well, it's in my job description or not in my job description, or, this is part of being a loving family member or what have you, or not. But be honest with yourself. If you don't want to do it, then why are you doing it? And if you're doing it out of a sense of obligation or expectation, or you've always done it that way, chances are it's not going to work out well. So be honest with yourself. Is there a clear contract that if you do this and the other person does that, you can proceed onwards? Clarity is healthy. Clarity is required. If it's not, chances are it may turn out poorly. And then lastly, it's between you and another person. Don't do anything more than 50% of the work. You start doing 51% of the work, you're going to be moving into a bad rescue. So these are all takeaways that we can use in reflection of Karpman's original work back late 60s. Still holds great relevance, not just for trauma survivors, abuse survivors, but boy, oh boy, this can be very, very powerful stuff. In running group programming, group therapy, at times we've marked parts of the group room. This in this corner is victim, this corner is persecutor, and this corner is rescuer, and have volunteers walk from the corners of the triangle and give us their self-talk, their narrative of how part of themselves identifies as victims, how part of themselves identify as persecutors, and how part of themselves identify as rescuers. We do that because we want the guys to become so familiar with these vulnerabilities that through their strengthening of their adult ego state, they can avoid getting on the triangle in the future. And if we can avoid getting on the triangle in the future, we will definitely live a happier and healthier life. So that's the main takeaway here. What we want for everyone, and particularly for abuse survivors, trauma survivors, it's a notion of empowerment. Empowerment is a ticket to that healthier, happier life. Empowerment can only occur in our adult ego state, being present, being rational, being proportionate in our emotional expression. If we can do all that, then we can take care of ourselves. And if we can take care of ourselves, we can also do our job in looking after others as well. So, Becky, I think that is it for the formal presentation. Yeah. So I'm going to say back to you, Becky, and if you wish, not meaning to put you on the spot, but do you have a default position you would like to share about the triangle?
Great. Thank you, Rick. We have had a couple folks join us since you began, so I would encourage folks who are watching, if you have a question or comment, please feel free to type it into the chat. We've got some time left here before the hour is up. But to answer your question, Rick, I think I very much identify with the rescuer persona. And I have gotten myself into some drama triangles in previous work situations in that role, that I should have just kind of, with your parenting example, kind of took a step back and said, you all work it out for yourselves. I don't need to be involved in this. So yes, I definitely identify with that and have absolutely found myself drawn into this triangle in the past.
Hmm. Some people describe it as like a huge sucking vortex, kind of forcing us onto the triangle, because of the power of our life experiences, our childhood experiences, and all that. And yet, we always have to remind ourselves that we do hold authority over ourselves. We don't have to get on the triangle just because of the sway or the power of it. We can choose an alternative course of action, and yet that's challenging work that requires a fair degree of mindfulness. It takes effort, and yet if we can apply that, much like my parenting situation, and I have my own stories of work situations, I'm sure, like you, unless we put that into action, we can easily find ourselves in a troubling spot.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. And yep, if folks have questions or want to share which of these you relate to the most, please feel free to share that in the chat. I've kind of in my own life, I have a sort of a branch of the family that's related. It's my dad's step family, and some of them have passed away, but some are still living. And there's just so much kind of dysfunction in that sort of branch of the family tree that I have sort of been invited into the edges of a triangle, and thankfully have recognized that and have made the decision to kind of cut off contact to preserve my own sense of peace. So it's difficult, when it's family or when it's people that you have affection for, but recognizing that it would just do more harm than good to be involved in that. It's a healthy decision, but not easy when it's family or folks that you care about.
No, you're absolutely right there, Becky. Yet the application of boundaries, which is one way we can be clear, both within ourselves, as well as be clear not to kind of jump on the triangle because the dynamics are presenting itself like that. It's probably the best ticket we have then to carve out a way of living in this world that is attuned within ourselves, rather than being just responsive of the issues or demands of others. So that can be a considerable bit of work. Again, particularly depending on one's childhood experiences in that regard.
Yes, and someone added in the chat, sometimes it's hard to point a finger who's at fault because it's someone you know and care about.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And yet even the notion of fault finding, we got to be careful with that one, because if you amplify fault finding, as in pointing finger, okay, there's a problem, you're the problem. Well, then we're jumping on the triangle, sort of de facto, in that regard. So it can be challenging to analyze a dynamic like that. Again, families, work teams, doesn't really matter, and yet not participate in that. And that's a fine line, and it requires pretty significant awareness to hold onto your adult sense of self, adult ego state sense of self.
So Rick, how can you or how can someone sort of balance? So I get your point about like not pointing fingers, not assigning fault blame, because then you're kind of getting sucked into the triangle. But on the other side of that is sort of a sense of kind of accountability. If someone has done something that causes harm, how do we promote accountability, I guess, in that sense, or do we?
Well, accountability is a conscious process. Um, we have to incorporate our thinking mind to even to have a conversation about accountability. The more we can make things conscious, the more we can be rational, the more we can be mindful, then we're going to have the best chances of finding a successful intervention or successful resolution of the issue. If I stumble into things, blindly, if I'm just being reactive, if I'm just by doing things because I've always done things this way, then it's not going to work out well. So I hold true to the notion of accountability, and yet in the heat of the moment, I'm not too sure if I have the best capacity or if anyone has the best capacity to discern accountability. And sometimes we get confused about accountability and fault finding in that regard. So in my notion of an analyzing, considering, using my pie example, well, I could say, well, boy, they did make an agreement, and it would appear that my eldest did eat the piece of pie. And yet that but that didn't necessarily come to me in the heat of the moment when I became a rescuer. So it's only with that conscious consideration that I think we can look at notions of accountability, notions of boundaries, notions of figuring out what's best for me in this situation. Do I hang out with these people who do X, Y, and Z, and that's problematic, or do I not? That's a decision best made when I'm away from that immediate dynamic than when I'm in the immediate dynamic. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, that's great, Rick. Thank you. So I know we've got a couple minutes left. If anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to put those into the chat. But Rick, while folks have an opportunity to think about that, I wanted to give you some space to talk about online support groups.
Hey, thank you, Becky. Yes, so this is a pitch for all folks who are listening to this webinar who identify themselves as male, any which way you define that. The organization 1in6 Inc., or looking for the website address, number 1in6.org, is a website resource for men who've experienced childhood sexual abuse or have experienced sexual assault as adults. 1in6.org is now part of the Zero Abuse network of services. And 5 days a week, on weekdays, we run an online support group for men who are seeking recovery from those wounds. So, for example, tonight there will be a group available at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday nights. On the website, there's a schedule of the five sessions we run each week. You can participate. It's free of charge. You don't have to give your name. You have to just come up with a nickname and agree to the terms of the group, and you're more than welcome to join us. We go for 90 minutes. We have some structure to the session. We do a little check-in, and then the guys work on particular issues that they've been facing in their life. So a lot of the group dynamic is pure support. And sometimes we move into a teaching piece. So maybe some nights I'll move into a teaching piece on the drama triangle. And guys can work on it in their own right and contribute their examples. And all this means towards working towards abuse recovery, trauma recovery, which truly means living a happier and healthier life. So if that has any appeal to you, I'd say come on, check it out. What we find is that after the first session is often a little anxious for new guys to join, but they come the next week and there are going to be a number of guys who've been there before, and the guys start getting connection between each other. There's always a therapist in the room, so I run the program a couple nights of the week. I have a colleague who runs the other programs. We work at keeping things safe and respectful, and yeah, come on and join us. That's my plug.
Great. Thank you so much, Rick. And we just had a thank you in the comments. Thanks for today's session. Made me have a different point of view in situations. So thank you.
Hey, glad to hear it.
All right, folks. Well, thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and hope you'll join us again for a future Survivor Circle.